Many of you know I'm a true advocate for taking supplementation to optimize your health, and one of the best things you can do is choose the right collagen. Collagen is a building block to your entire body. I was introduced to Sparkle Wellness product Skin Boost Plus about a year ago, and I've been taking it ever since. Now they've launched a new bone strength product that I'm super excited about. New Osteo Boost Collagen is formulated to improve bone mineral density, something we all need to think about as early as age 40. Made with award-winning collagen peptide known as Fortibone, the product really has led to meaningful results for people who need significant improvement in this area, including those suffering with fractures or broken bones. OsteoBoost is a great choice for anyone over the age of 40 to reduce the risk of bone mineral density loss, a major precursor to the diagnosis of bone-related diseases. Right now, you can get any of the Sparkle Wellness collagen supplements from Amazon or from their website, lovesparkle.life, and use my code DrFit for 20% off. That's DRFIT at lovesparkle.life for 20% off their new product, OsteoBoost. Welcome to the Fit and Fabulous podcast with Dr. Jaime Seaman. Hello, everybody. It's Dr. Jaime, and welcome back to the Fit and Fabulous podcast. It is so great to have you here today. I have an incredible guest that I cannot wait to introduce you to. His name is Jason Prall, and he is a health educator, practitioner, author, and filmmaker. In 2018, his independent research and experience as a practitioner led him to create the Human Longevity Project. It's a 9-part film series that uncovers the true nature of chronic disease in our modern world. He's currently working on his next film series that explores ancient methods of healing, mind, body, and soul from indigenous cultures around the world. He's recently released his best-selling new book titled Beyond Longevity, a proven plan for healing faster, feeling better, and thriving at any age. Jason, welcome to the Fit and Fabulous podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay, so I did a little digging on you, and I can't wait to talk about the Human Longevity project that you did. That's what we're going to pick apart today in our talk. But tell us a little bit about your background, because I heard before you got into this space, you were a mechanical engineer, and I feel like everybody has a story that somehow led them to like their true purpose and passion.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, right? Like I followed that path not for any other reason other than essentially cultural conditioning and following what I was sort of naturally good at, right? And I had a limited perspective as a child, like most of us do, as we go through high school and college, perhaps, of what the world looks like, right? And so I had this idea that I was good at math, I was good at science, I was good at systems thinking, so only because I was good at those things, I had a moderate interest in them, right? Like we all kind of like the things that we're good at, right? I mean, I was good at baseball and football, and so I played that in college, and then I did engineering because I don't know what else to do, and it has a decent status symbol in the States, and so all these things, right? So I just followed kind of this thing, but I had no idea what I was really passionate about. I had no idea. Of course, this was in 1999, right? The internet hadn't even exploded yet. So little did I know what was going to be unfolding over the next 20 years, right? And what the possibilities would be. And so I just kind of followed a path, and it served me really well in a sense. Like it set up a good life for me. It allowed me to do the things that I thought I wanted to do. And then I kind of woke up one day, and I say one day, and it was probably over the course of weeks, months, years, but I realized at some point that the way that I was living wasn't conducive to my true passion, my dream, right? Like the real dream that I have in this world. And it wasn't even fully elucidated to that degree, but I recognized that I wasn't living it, right? I was sort of stuck. I had a mortgage. I had a job that was successful. I had all the things that I guess that I idealized, or that was inculcated in me in my sort of cultural conditioning, but it wasn't really exciting to me. The things that were exciting to me were essentially nothing tying me down, ultimate freedom to explore, to get curious about the world and who I am and my place in it and what I am here to do, and all the big questions we have in life. And I felt like I couldn't live that, right? And it was a lot of my own health conditions and issues that I had starting at 13 years old, chronic joint pains in my knees. Then it moved to my shoulders. And I had skin issues in college. So I had just a number of things that the traditional medical system wasn't able to to help me at all. Like they were giving me steroid creams, they were giving me like Selsun Blue to put on my face, right? Like, I mean, it was ridiculous, the stuff that I was doing, and none of it really worked. And so it forced me to look outside of that system to figure out how to help myself. And so it was through that process that I just kind of woke up to a lot of things, right? I mean, obviously today we call it red pilled, right? So we didn't have that term back then, but I was essentially getting red pilled on all kinds of things, right? The government collusion with big pharma and big ag and big medicine, like all that stuff, and just the messiness that was there, right? And it's really just people acting out of their own best interests and where the incentives lie, right? So I wasn't even demonizing individuals that were in these positions or what have you, but the incentive structure was so skewed and so ridiculous that it wasn't set up to serve me, the one suffering from joint pain or skin conditions, right? And so through that, I recognized that I had an opportunity to not only help myself, but help other people, right? And I realized that if I was suffering with the sort of minor things, relatively speaking, that I was dealing with, and how painful psychologically, emotionally, and physically it was for me, then there's a lot of other people that might be able to use my services, my awareness around some of these things to help get them out of that system, right? And I realized that, and because it's so convoluted and because it's such a corrupt system, and I speak like just generally speaking, if we can pull people out of this sort of big pharma nightmare that they get stuck in, and that's going to serve them unbelievably well, right? So not only are they going to stop lining the coffers of the insurance companies and big pharma, and the system that's just broken, but now they can actually start living, right? And that's the thing. Like when you are caught in a chronic disease state and you have chronic symptoms, perhaps unknown syndromes, like your sole focus, like it takes so much of your life force energy to just hold it together, let alone to try to improve, right? And that means that you can't live your purpose. That means you can't even explore your purpose, or at least it's hard to know where to go with that, right? And so that was really the driver for me to exit that engineering world, something I'm not passionate about. I threw away like a really good career to start this sort of online health coaching, functional medicine style of practice that I wasn't really familiar with, but I knew that health world pretty well. Then I had to learn the business side, which was that was something else. Like that was a totally different thing that I wasn't prepared for, and I lost a lot of money in the process. And it was an education that I essentially paid for, but ultimately it got me to a position where I could work and live in the way that serves my soul. That really I can embody this sort of passionate living in everything that I do, and I'm beyond grateful for it. And looking back now, I can see that all of that was divine. That it was all for my best interest. I just didn't have the clarity to sort of see the end game.
Yeah. Having your passions is one thing, monetizing them is another thing.
Totally.
And, but the whole time you're talking, I'm just over here like slow clapping in my head because I work in Western medicine. I work in traditional medicine, and I resonate with a lot of the things that you're saying. And, which is why I spend so much of my free time outside of my actual clinical practice doing things like this and recording podcasts like this, because I think these are really things that people need, the wool pulled off their eyes. So you're working as a mechanical engineer, you're sick, you don't feel fulfilled. You have these other passions that you want to pursue. Bridge the gap for us going from that to this human longevity project that you did, and tell us the scope of this project, because this involves a lot of people, producers, traveling, and that's not like that's not an easy undertaking. That's not just like, oh, I think I don't want to be a mechanical engineer anymore. That's like a big undertaking.
Totally. And it is in a sense, right? But and you know this, that when you're in your purpose, when you're living your dream, you can take on the most unbelievably difficult, challenging, time-consuming tasks, and they don't drain you, they fuel you, right? So that's the irony, that I found myself in. But to the essence of your question, and the Human Longevity Project is a 9-part film series that we created to try to elucidate sort of why we're so sick in the West and what's going on in other parts of the world where people are living to beyond 100, relatively disease-free, right? Like that's a really interesting paradox that we are seeing right now, and it's even been more exposed, I'd say, over the last few years. But really, it started in my clinical practice, right? And I was seeing people with autoimmune conditions and cancer and digestive issues, skin conditions, infections, like you name it, and then unknown syndromes. That was really what I would get. There's all these these people coming to me because I didn't advertise my services, partially because I didn't really know how to advertise like what I was doing, and I didn't really feel like I had like an MD. I didn't have any credentials behind me, and so I could only prove myself to the people that I worked with, and then they spread the word. So everything was word of mouth, and so it came from the people that I was working with, and I would get these people that would come to me in just dire straits, right? They'd seen 8 functional medicine doctors, 3 naturopaths, 2 acupuncturists. Like they've seen everybody, and every one of those professions is fantastic, right? So it's not a matter of the profession is bad or inadequate or insufficient. It's just the person that they saw weren't able to see the bigger picture, right? And for whatever reason, and so I saw a lot of these people, and I was able to move them forward. Many I was able to get sort of to let's say fully better, to the point where they felt like, okay, I'm back to normal, right? Whatever that means. And then some I couldn't quite get there, right? And so there was something looming in the background there that I was missing, that I wasn't seeing. But for a lot of these people, for every person pretty much that came to me, we could run the functional test, right? We can look at the metabolomics. We could look at, circadian rhythm, physiology, cortisol patterns, melatonin patterns, their conversions. Are they methylating? We could do all these functional tests. We could look at the microbiome, and that was fantastic, and it was very helpful. But what I found is that at the end of the day, people would come to me, and I thought it was really, we didn't really want to start with testing, because I could analyze their lifestyle and their behaviors and say, well, there's a lot of things we can clean up without even running a test. So I don't need to look at your cortisol patterns and melatonin patterns, because I know how you're sleeping based on what you're telling me. And I can essentially guess what those patterns are going to look like. And not only that, I know how we can improve them without doing any testing, right? So I was basically teaching this sort of lifestyle medicine, right? How do we improve circadian rhythm, right? This idea that your biology is functioning based on these inputs, primarily light and exercise and food, right? And this timing of your biology. How do we improve the metabolic function, right? At the cellular level? Are you metabolically flexible, right? Are you able to burn fat for fuel as well as glucose for fuel in the way that your body needs to, when it needs to, right? Are you able to fast? Like, these tell me a lot just based on that. And then the piece that I was really missing, that I eventually got a hold of, was the trauma piece. Let us say loosely called trauma. This idea that we have these experiences, particularly when we're young, that we haven't processed fully, right? That we weren't able to fully move through our system, right? And partially, mostly because we're young beings that don't have a fully developed nervous system. So we quite literally can't understand the world cognitively. Don't have this understanding of what's happening. And so all we experience when we're really little is the feeling that we're feeling. And we can't even understand that. We just understand it on the feeling level. So when we are unable to process an emotion, process an experience, and that sort of leaves a residue, so to speak, a psychological residue, an emotional residue that we then use to adapt as we get older, right? So there's all these sort of like traumas and conditionings that may or may not be from something significant like abuse or something like that. They could be, getting mocked or laughed at in school repetitively, continuously, right? Misattuned by our parents. Like they weren't able to accept us as a really sensitive, emotional being because they had a lot going on and they just had to control the environment, right? There's all kinds of these sort of traumas and conditionings that we experienced. And so that was a huge, huge piece that I missed for a long time. And even when I found it, I didn't really know how to work with it. I could recognize the trauma in people just based on their behaviors, on their like the things that they would do, the things that they would think and say, and all these sort of feelings and beliefs that were coming through. Even an email, you can pick it up through an email just based on the word choices and how people are speaking, right? So, so I was working with all these sort of things that didn't have anything really to do with functional medicine testing and all these amazing, cool things that we can do based on our sort of biological understanding. And so I thought, well, instead of just like teaching every person that came to me sort of the lifestyle medicine piece first, and I was getting kind of burnt out seeing clients one-on-one, and I couldn't figure out a way to scale that without raising my prices, exorbitantly,
right,
and or hiring a bunch of coaches to work with me and under me and educating. And I didn't really want to go down that path. So I thought, well, I actually want to create a documented film series to share this education with hundreds of thousands of people and set myself up in a more educational space, so that I can sort of be in more of a media educational space instead of one-on-one direct clinical work. And that clinical work served me so well in terms of my understanding and why are people struggling and where the trip ups are and what we really need to focus on. And so that's what we did. I decided that I want to go out and I love traveling. So let's go to the blue zones, right? And that was the thing. Like, how can I deliver the message, of circadian rhythm and environmental toxins and clearing the system and microbiota function and how that works with the immune system and how it communicates to mitochondria, how important mitochondria are in sort of this longevity, aging process, and really all disease states, metabolic dysfunctions, right? And trauma and raising healthy children and how we look at Alzheimer's and cancer particularly as we get older. So these were all the things that I wanted to encapsulate in a documentary film series, which is quite a lot, right? Trying to explain and teach these things from not only just a boring layman's perspective, but to really get into the science and explain the science really, really well. Right? Because then what I found is that when I was working with clients, I would give them very basic instructions on what to do, right? Like in the morning, you may have to start with an alarm at first, but hopefully you eventually get to waking up without an alarm. Wake up and go outside and get light in your eyes in the morning. Like, it's a very simple task. And usually the thought was, well, how is that going to help me overcome autoimmune conditions or food sensitivities or whatever it is they were struggling with, this skin issue that I have? How the heck is that going to work, right? So I'd have to explain this really complex science of how chronobiology works and circadian rhythm and how light goes into the eye and hits the optic chiasm and then speaks to the pituitary and the hypothalamus and then communicate to the hormonal systems throughout your body and regulates every hormone. And there's all these clock genes inside every cell of the body that then dictate the epigenetic expression of your liver and your kidney and your bones, and every cell in your body is governed by this time clock, which is primarily guided by the light. So when you get that light in the morning, now your internal clock goes, oh, I know it's morning. Kick on all these functions, suppress all these other functions, thyroid, right? Like everything starts to shift based on this light cycle. And we know this through the observational data, through the clinical data. All-cause mortality, every disease that we know of will increase for those who are working shift work, right? Doctors are a huge one in this, and nurses in this arena. Everything starts to derail, and you can hold it together when you're young because you have tons of vitality. Right? But as that vitality starts to weaken and we get into our older ages, then everything starts to fall apart because the circadian rhythm is the foundational principle by which our biology operates. So now all of a sudden, this simple instruction of when you wake up, first thing you do is go outside and get light in your eyes to set your internal clock becomes this really profound thing. So I had to explain like the complex science to some degree, and then they go, oh, cool, yeah, I'm going to do that. And then what would happen? People would lose weight. They would get better sleep. Their cortisol would rise in the morning, and they would feel really energized, and they have a better day. Their mood would increase. They wouldn't crave as many sugary foods and fatty and processed foods. Everything about their day was improved because they regularly got up and got sunlight in their eyes in the morning. Whether it was winter, whether it was summer, doesn't matter. Whether it was clouds in the sky, your biology, your eyes are sensitive enough to pick up that light, right? So this was what I was teaching my clients, and I thought, this is what I want to teach to as many people as I can, because that is where the difference starts to be made. And all the people that are doing the amazing functional medicine work, integrative work, even traditional medical work, everything's going to improve if their patients and their clients know how to live in a way that is conducive to healing. So now even the pharmaceutical drugs can work better. And we know this. Cancer drugs work better when they're timed with circadian biology. So when these cancer drugs are given at the right time, things improve. And when they given it at the wrong time, they don't improve as much, right? So Chinese medicine has known this for a long time. Ayurveda has known this for a long time. So these things are here. We've known about these. And now our pharmaceutical and our medical systems are starting to adopt these things, which is really exciting, right? So these are the things I wanted to teach that. And so we did that through the lens of the longest living people. And I thought, somebody that's 98 and relatively healthy or 104, I guarantee you they're going to do all these things, right? Like there's a fundamental way to live that will precipitate health, that will induce health, because that is our natural state, right? We just got to get rid of the blocking factors and align with our natural status and what our body wants to do and what it's been conditioned to for thousands of years. Then things will be in harmony.
Yeah. Okay. So you go out on this project and you are going to travel to these blue zones and find these 70, 80, 90, 100-year-old people. How do you find them though? How, I mean, you interviewed some great people for the project, but where do you find these people? You just walk down the street and look for the old people? Like,
Yeah, there's not like a directory, although I wish there kind of was. But that was actually the fun part and very disconcerting at the same time, right? Because we'd have to travel, and the reason we went to the blue zones was not to investigate the blue zone work further. And for those who aren't familiar with the blue zones, it's these regions that have been identified, statistically identified by Michel Poulin and Dan Buettner and National Geographic. They found these places that have an inordinate amount of centenarians, people that made it to 100, right? So it's statistically significant, and they identified these regions in order to sort of say what's different about them, what's going on here in these regions, right? And they did that work, and it was great, and no knock on it. I do think that what we tried to do was go further into the scientific reasoning about not just the commonalities of these places, right? And they were identified as Icaria, Greece, Sardinia, which is an island off of Italy, Okinawa, and then the Guanacaste sort of region of Costa Rica. And so we weren't really concerned with like, what are they all doing the same? And, I kind of knew the fundamental reasons. It's interesting, the similarities and the differences. Like that is interesting to look at because it explains something deeper, in my opinion. When they can all eat different foods, what does that tell you? It tells you that it's not really the food. There's no one specific food for a person, right? So we can get into that a little bit more, but essentially that's the blue zones. And we wanted to go to those places just because that's where we figured we could find 100-year-olds that were exhibiting a lot of the same behavioral patterns that explained the fundamental essence of how our biology functions. And so, we went to Costa Rica first, and I speak a little Spanish, not enough to really make any headway. But we would always have to find a fixer, right? What we called a fixer, somebody in the area that spoke English and the local language that could at least get us going, right? And basically we knocked on doors, right? We went into these small rural villages. And the cool part about that is everybody knows each other, right? So you can ask one person at a coffee shop, say, hey, we're doing this film project. We're looking for these people that are in their, 80s, 90s, 100s. Do you know anybody? They say, oh, no, I don't know. But, Lucia down on, take 8 blocks that way, and they go this way toward the ocean 1 block, and then you'll find Lucia. Okay, right? So there's no like addresses in these places.
Google map.
Yeah, exactly. And so we just go find Lucia and knock on her door and say, hey, here we are. We're doing this thing. We'd love to interview you. So the cool part was, because of the era that they grew up in and the societal structure and the sort of communal, I mean, we just talked before the podcast, you're in Nebraska, right? It's this more small town feel probably where you're at than where I am in Southern California. And so there's a communal feel, there's a connectivity in these sort of rural regions that allows us to do this, right? So that's what we did. And luckily we found some amazing people that way, but every time, Okinawa was a tough one to be able to find somebody that spoke English and Japanese, or sometimes even old Okinawan, which is a different language, to be able to connect us with these people and then translate, the things. Like it wasn't an easy task for a small budget film. We weren't a major production company. And so it was just 2 guys going around and seeing if we can capture this stuff. And we got some amazing footage, and we learned so much about how they lived, right? Because what was really interesting about that was we can look at what they're doing now, and that's great. But to me, it was like, somebody is 95 years old. I want to know what they were doing when they were 15, when they were 6, right? Like you've got kids. That is where all the foundations are laid down to who they become. And of course, we can adapt and we can change, and we can progress, and we can heal things and process things from our youth, and that's great. But so much of who we are is really laid down between essentially preconception, right? What happens with our parents and grandparents, that's a lot of who we are, as well as up until 7, 8, 10, something like that, right? Like so I wanted to know what life was like for them back then. And when you ask those questions, things get revealed that are quite amazing, that lead to a different understanding of what it means to be old or to live a long time, particularly in those regions.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about diet, because you kind of alluded to the fact that you went lots of places and they don't all eat the same way or eat the same things. Because I feel like in the US, like you get on social media and people are like vegan, plant-based, or they're carnivore, or they're Mediterranean, or like they've got these, like a word that describes their diet.
You've got a million of them, right? Yeah.
And then standard American diet, right? Like, what does that mean? So obviously you're not going into these places, like what kind of diet do you eat? So talk to me about like what you learned about their nutrition and diet from maybe what they did when they were younger to like what they did as they were older. Cause, certainly 90 years is a long time. And there were a lot of changes within their community and things. So tell us kind of what you learned about that.
Yeah, well, what's interesting about that is you're hitting on something I think is a fundamental thing that we kind of gloss over in the West, which is that in all likelihood, diet should change for each individual throughout their life. Even if the structure of the society is the same, right? You don't feed the same foods to a 2-year-old that you do to your 10-year-old, right? That can change. And same thing when we get into our 20s and 30s, we probably should be eating a different diet than when we're 92, right? Digestion tends to be weaker when we're in our 90s than it is when we're in our adolescence, right? So that means that we actually have the ability to process and digest foods differently. So that indicates that we probably should be listening to our bodies and saying, okay. And what we found was that was the case. Most people that we interviewed in their 80s and 90s, most of them ate meat at some point in their life. And when they got older, a lot of them tended to stray away from meat a little bit. Now, this might fly in the face of some of the things that we talk about in the West about maintaining muscle mass and how important, amino acids are and all these things. But what they realized was that's all great, but if you can't digest it, then what are we talking about? Right? If you don't have the hydrochloric acid production, the digestive enzymes, and the ability for you to break down those proteins, then maybe we should be looking at something different, because that's all that's going to cause is inflammation. And that's what we see, right? We see that in the West with things like gluten. Gluten is simply just a protein that we're unable to break down very well, right? If somebody can break it down into the amino acids don't cause any inflammation, no problem in the system. Right. And so this is what we find. And it's interesting to note that they would feed, oftentimes children would eat more fruits, more heavily based on fruits, because it's super easy to digest. Children's digestive systems aren't as strong, like young children. Right. And then when we get into our early teens and adolescence and adulthood, our digestion's great. Right. And then it starts to weaken again. And then you'd see a little bit more fruits and easy vegetables that you would cook. Right. And so this is what we found in those diets. Now, the framework of the diets were dependent on the culture and the context and the environment, right? So in Sardinia, they ate tons of bread. All year round, nothing but bread. It was fundamental. It was a staple. Every person we talked to said that, like, no, bread, it's important. We need it, right? And there's a religious bent there. So a lot of it was informed based on that. But their bread was different, right? And so everything about the way that they grew the grains, they didn't grow the wheats that we grow here. They grew a totally different species of grain, and they milled it in the house with a donkey, like going around in circles, right? And then they baked it fresh, and they did their things the way they did them, right? So that's a totally different food than what I would go and buy a hamburger
and me buying
bun.
a loaf of bread at the
Totally.
grocery store here,
right? Or a hot dog bun or whatever, right? So that's a different animal, right? And not only that, what's interesting about these regions that I think people forget to consider is that if you live in Sardinia today and you're one of these elders, you came from a long lineage of people who did the same things and ate the same foods over and over and over again for years and years and years. So their bodies were adapted to these cultural foods very, very well, right? So their microbiome, their mitochondria, their digestive capacity all favored those types of foods that they've been eating for thousands of years. So this cultural conditioning, even to the level of digestion, is set in, right? So that's an interesting thing to consider as well. In most places, they ate a lot of beans, right? So in Costa Rica, tons of beans, rice, corn, as you would expect. That was a staple, right? Tomatoes were big in Icaria, in Sardinia, right? So the bottom line is that in every one of these cultures, we could find offensive food types that we classify as harmful in the West, right? They ate cheeses, they ate dairy, they ate meat, they ate fruits of all kinds, right? We're told that too much fruit is high glycemic, and don't do that. We're told that, these vegetables, they contain plant toxins, perhaps, all kinds of things that we don't
phytic acid and oxalates and lectins.
Exactly, right? And then the lectins, right? That's a big one too these days. Dr. Gundry, shout out to making that a big thing, right? And the truth is, none of these are wrong, right? They're just partial truths. They're truths in a given context. And that's the important thing, right? If you're living in Costa Rica where it's hot most of the year, you have a wet season and a dry season, and fruit is growing all year round, right? The fruit changes. So there's seasonal fruits that grow at different times of the year. When they're working hard and you're working outside all day long, yeah, carbohydrates and fruits, not going to be a big problem for blood glucose levels, for maintaining glycemic control, insulin levels, metabolic function, because you're literally working your tail off all day long, right? And then they don't eat after the sun goes down, most of them, right? So it's the way they eat, it's when they eat, it's how much they ate, and they ate in a way that was in balance, right? This is the problem, and this was one of the other things that we wanted to address in our film series, was that we wanted to separate and make distinctions between the Human Longevity Project, or in how they lived in the blue zones and how we live here, right? We're faced with different challenges than they are faced with. And they were faced with different challenges than we're faced with. We live in the life of luxury. We have comfort to no end. We don't have to struggle. Like, I don't want to go back to a life where no refrigeration exists. There's no cars, no electricity. Like, that doesn't sound like fun to me. I mean, I go camping and that's awesome, but then I want to come home and I want to sleep in my bed and I want to turn on lights and get something out of the fridge. And I want to do Zoom calls, right? Like, this is an interesting dynamic. And for them, the thing that they never had to struggle with was walking into a grocery store and saying no to this processed food and no to that processed food and no to that yummy ice cream there and no to that piece of pizza and no to the happy hours. Although they had a lot of happy hours, they did their own thing, their own way. But you know what I mean? Like, we have to actually say no to a lot of things to try to live, to eat a diet that is whole, that is, perhaps local, seasonal, organic, right? Like, we have to work so hard to get an organic apple, right? They didn't have to work hard. That's just what was there everywhere, all the time, right? So, and they ate food seasonally. So we're faced with very, very different challenges, and it's all contextual how we think about diet. And one of the things that they ate in balance because they had to grow their own food in large part, right? Sure, they did some hunting, but again, that was respective of season and where the animals were and what was available. And then if you let's say you hunted an animal, what are you going to do with it? Because you don't have refrigeration, so you have to find a way to either eat it or preserve it in a fashion that makes sense for your region. Right. So they ate, if they overate, that just means they got to plant more in the gardens and take more of their field. And it's going to take more time and more energy. And that doesn't make sense. Right. So you eat in a way that's going to be totally in balance, in harmony with your environment. And truth be told, many of them had suffered from, these sort of starvation like periods, right? These actual, and I'm not talking about like this idea of intermittent fasting and how glorious this is that we can fast. Like, they didn't have food for like months, and they were rationed foods from the government sometimes, and they struggled. Crop might have just completely been decimated because of the seasonal, either lack of rain or too much rain or whatever it might be. So they were forced to go through very difficult times. And of course, this made them more sort of anti-fragile, right? This makes them more resilient. And we know the benefits of some of this stuff, but they struggled and they had to really work to live healthy. But it was done in a very different way. So it really comes down to not really what they ate. Because yes, in our modern context, I would not advise eating wheat and tons of bread, and I would not advise eating tons of foods that are rich in lectins. I would advise cooking them and finding ways to reduce the lectin content, the phytic acid, as you mentioned. Right? There's all these things that we actually are finding causing us problems, and the cultural cuisines and the way they cooked foods in some of these regions naturally reduced some of those plant toxins that can be a little aggressive. But ultimately, it's not the food. It's how it's prepared. It's how much you're eating. Are you digesting? Are you chewing thoroughly? Right? Like, this is something we overlook in our culture massively. Instead, we just pop enzymes and maybe some hydrochloric acid, and we think, oh, that's good, and probiotics. When in reality, if you chewed your food thoroughly, you ate only when you're really actually hungry, like really hungry. Now your digestive capacity is through the roof, right? So these are some of the basic things, the timing of when you ate, how much you ate, These are the real key factors. And then, of course, listening to your body and saying, okay, this doesn't really agree with me. And I tend to do well on a little bit more carbohydrate rich diet because I exercise a lot and I have a very demanding schedule and because of my constitution, my genetics. And then somebody else might find that higher fat or higher protein, whatever the case is, that's where we're all unique and individuated. And depending on where we're at in our life, are we running marathons or are we, sitting on a chair 10 hours a day doing work, right? These are all variations based on context, and that's what's important.
Yeah, I think you did a nice job of kind of highlighting that depending on where you live in the world, our modern luxuries, everything comes with a payoff, like when we had industrialized agriculture and we had the ability to grow fields and fields and fields of grains and all these things, like that's how kind of like our world evolved. I had the opportunity this year to go down to Santiago, Chile to speak. And it was very interesting for me to go down there. And, I come into Santiago and there's a Starbucks and a Wendy's and like all the same modern, things that we have here in the US, like right there in Santiago, Chile too. And, the doctors there were telling me that they have some of the same, I mean, you can Uber, it was amazing to me. Like Uber Eats down there, there's like all these, it was mostly men, all these guys on bikes and they have these like cooler backpacks on. And I mean, there's like hundreds of them. They're just like zooming by like on the street all the time. And, people are it's just quicker to like have them run to the convenience store and get you stuff and bring you stuff. And so it's very interesting for me to hear you kind of say that, when you go into these villages where they have to grow and they have to be more physically active, they have to walk to get their food and to get their water and all those things. So diet's one thing.
Real quick, I want to hit on that because you hit on something really, really important. And I'm not sure we'll ever see a new quote unquote blue zone again. And I know Michel Poulin, he's the demographer who actually identified the first blue zone. At least that's his story. And he circled it and said, okay, this is the blue zone because he was able to go to the region and identify the birth certificates and truly verify. Well, what we're seeing now, and we saw this in Okinawa, is they have something called hamburger syndrome. That's their term. And because of the McDonald's and the Starbucks and all this sort of westernized living is coming into that world, and all of a sudden people are getting obese. And I mean, they're having the same problems. And I would argue that they're actually the rates of increase are higher than what we're seeing in the West because they lived this sort of natural life in for so long. Now they're just automatically so quickly being introduced this sort of hyper novelty of the diet. And again, it's hard to resist. Like straight up, this stuff is on some level, it's really tasty, right? Like they have food engineers and scientists doing their stuff to make it tasty and appetizing, right? On another level, it's quite gross, but like there's a natural, it's hitting our natural appetites, right? The salt and the sweet and the fat, and it's just like in the crunch, like there's this perfect combination of things, and they're working so hard to attract that. And so when this comes into their environment and they're like, hey, this is great. We got Kentucky Fried Chicken. This is awesome, right? And it's causing all kinds of problems. So and we're seeing this over and over again, this westernization of even these sort of rural areas. And the other part to that is because we are now this global society of sharing information and the ability to travel, a lot of the kids that are growing up in the mountainous regions of Sardinia are now leaving to Cagliari, which is the big city in Sardinia, which it's not a longevity zone at all, right? So now you got these people leaving these regions, which is the exact opposite thing of which you really need to create a homogenous, society that is very healthy over the long term. So we're starting to mix it all up now, and there's so much westernization that I actually don't think we're going to see these pockets of healthy people unless it's something like places that have been ostracized, like Cuba, right? That was actually one of the places Michelle was looking. Is like, hey, I'll look there because it hasn't been westernized. The president, even though it's poor and there's a lot of problems with it, the way they're living is in many regions of that place is still coming from that older traditions. And so there's other places like Crete and Russia, and there's places. But I'm just not convinced that we're actually going to find one again because of this sort of movement and these ideas that are spreading.
Maybe we should make one. Let's get some land.
So there's somebody that
Everybody
have done
move
this.
there.
Yeah,
Where?
Guernsey. Yeah, in Guernsey, there's an island in off the UK, place called Guernsey. It's kind of between France and the UK, and it's got both French and English influence. And it's a small island where it's small enough to where they could actually all say, yeah, let's inculcate sort of health and longevity. And so I think they're still trying to accomplish that. But again, to be a centenarian takes 100 years, right? Like this stuff you can't change overnight. And like I said, for so long, the things that really drove these people to be healthy in their 80s, 90s, 100s is the 70 years before that, and primarily the first 10 years of life. And even beyond that, the generational stuff, like that is so critical. And we have science now that has shown exactly what I'm talking about in this sort of generational transfer of trauma and nervous system sort of, let's say, hypervigilance.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously diet is one thing, and you touched on earlier kind of this biopsychosocial. Obviously, there's other things that contribute to the fact that they live to be 100 years, sleep, getting more sunlight, like all of these things. But you were saying like you learned so much as a practitioner, and I do the same thing when I'm sitting talking to a patient. Like I'm thinking about like the oxidative stress of what they're doing and their mitochondria. And like, I'm thinking of all these things, right? But like when you go into Sardinia, like you're not like, hey, what are you doing to help your mitochondria?
I was tempted, by the way, to like do testing, but I thought, no, it's just going to go down rabbit holes that don't really matter.
So like what other things besides eating a, culturally appropriate, geographically appropriate diet, like what other things did you pick out of there that you made the connection to like mitochondria and microbiome and longevity?
Yeah, and I want to connect those two dots, right? Because you probably know this, but many listeners don't. That we have microbes, of course, in our gut. We've known this for a while. It's a big area of study, and it's been talked about. We have also microbes everywhere in our body, right? On our skin, in our eyes, in our liver. They're everywhere, right? So they are a fundamental aspect of who we are, right? And we in fact have more microbe genes than we do human genes, right? So there's an argument of like, are you actually more microbe or are you human? What is it to be a human, right? And then of course, so they have their own genetics, right? So they have their own sort of, let's say, agenda based on this symbiotic relationship between this organism that they're inhabiting, right? That they're working in. And so they have needs, right? And then we have mitochondria, which many people aren't aware that they have their own genes, right? And there's debate on how we sort of have those within our cells, but these mitochondria, they're thought of as the power plant or the energy center, but they do so much more. They produce hormones, right? They take out the waste, right? They communicate with all kinds of things going on at the cellular level. So they are really, really important organelles, and they have their own circular DNA. So now we have microbe DNA, we have mitochondria DNA, and then we have human DNA. And so we have three genetic, and I say classifications of genetics, right? So even of the microbes, there's all kinds of different DNA there. So now you have the mitochondria, and that primarily comes from mother, right? So the mitochondrial DNA is passed down through the female lineage. So now we have, again, these three genetic components that are all somehow communicating to create health and balance in a real-time way, right? Like we're so amazed by AI and machine learning now, but like this is like, the human body blows it out of water. I mean, like billions and billions and billions and billions of interactions constantly, like every second, right? To keep things humming and communicating. So those communication mechanisms are really important. So to get fixated on human DNA and telomeres and the genetics and what gets expressed in methylation patterns and deacetylation patterns and all these things, that's all well and good. But the question is, and people know that if they've worked with cancer, what are the mitochondria doing, right? Like what's going on at that level, because that's communicating to DNA what to turn on and what to turn off and how to express. So we need to know what the mitochondria are doing. And same thing, mitochondria are receiving the signals from whatever the genetics are expressing. And then same thing with the microbes. They're sending out signals communicating to mitochondria So these secondary metabolites, when you eat a food or when you don't eat a food, their natural behavior is communicating via reactive oxygen species, hydrogen sulfide. There's all kinds of things that are going on at that level. So when you eat a blueberry, sure, you get those phytochemicals, the polyphenols from the blueberry, but it's your microbes that digest the components of the sugar and the colors and all the chemicals of that blueberry, and then they spit out secondary metabolites, right? And those metabolites then can improve the gut. They can communicate to the cell on how much energy is inputting. So there's a three-way communication going on at that level, and so that becomes a huge factor in this whole equation of, am I healthy?
Okay, yeah, that's fascinating. Okay, so when you are working as a practitioner, because you work with people, you still work with people since the project
I do,
launched?
yeah, a little bit differently. I'm mostly on like trauma and things like that, but yes, I'm still very much in sort of chronic disease states as well.
Okay, so for somebody listening, obviously we have talked about how difficult it is in the US with our modern technologies and things like that. It's really hard to find like good food and like do all the right things because of the way that our world's set up. So I guess give people like your top 3 tips. If they tomorrow are like, I want to start working on my longevity, like what are the 3 things to focus on?
Yeah, and to tie in kind of your last question, which I never actually answered, so sorry about that. Really, the way to think about us is that we are open energetic systems, right? Which means that everything we think, feel, do, everything that's impacting us, light and sound, and again, beliefs and all the things, these are all impacting how our genes get expressed, the mitochondrial genes, the human genes, and the microbe genes, right? And that's the mechanism, right? And our nervous system is kind of the interface between the unseen world and the seen world, right? And this is what the shamans have understood for a long time. And there's an old phrase, I believe, comes from Ayurveda that says we don't even experience the world as it is. We only experience our own nervous system, right? So, and that's really, really a deep concept to meditate on and to sit with, because it gets to the core of some of these things that we all differ on, right? Like there was that sound that sounded like, some people thought it said Yanny and some people thought it said Laurel. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's this combination of sounds, and based on certain things, you might hear Yanny and then you might hear Laurel, or somebody else might hear Laurel, and they're convinced. It says no, it says Laurel. And the same thing with the colors, right? We had that dress that was a big thing, right? And there's the taste of cilantro. Some people, I think, say it tastes like soap.
I have the gene. I have the gene.
You do? Okay.
The soap gene.
So it tastes like soap. That's
so
weird.
Can't stand it. It ruins the whole dish.
So this is the core of what I'm getting at here is, what's the truth, right? The truth for you is that it does taste like soap, no question. We know that people feel pain differently. So some people feel the same amount of pressure and it really hurts, and some people, doesn't really hurt that much.
Totally. I believe that because I watch childbirth all day, and I'll see a woman who I'm like, she's either really stoic or her labor does not feel like this woman over here who's like dropping F-bombs and like ready to like catapult into another galaxy.
Yeah. And in Ayurveda, they talk about this based on your constitution. If you're more Vata type, which is kind of thin and cold and there's a lot of other characteristics, but they feel pain more than if you're a Kapha type, which is a little bit more robust, right? A little more husky, thicker boned. And so we feel different. Everything is different about us. So with that, we have a unique constitution, right? So we all need to be doing different things. And this is why when we're all looking for gurus out there, and this person's saying one thing and that person's saying another thing, and he's saying them over there, and no, do this. They're all kind of right. It just depends on the context, right? So this is the thing where I hope we can get to a point where we stop arguing about which diet and which exercise and which way to do things is the quote unquote best way, because it all is so contextual for each individual, right? Exercise is so different for everybody, right? And diet and everything we do. So they're all partially right. So we all experience a different reality. And so that means that all these energetic inputs that we're taking in on a regular basis. And right now, probably our biggest issue is stimuli. We are overstimulated. We do not get into rest, right? And this is a key part of resilience and building a strong system, is you want to operate at the extremes. You want to operate in rest and darkness and quiet, right? And then you want to work out and do the things that are intense, right? So you want to be in the intense mode. You want to be in the hot, you want to be in the cold, right? You want to be in darkness, you want to be in the light. And I'm not talking, and the problem we have now is that we're kind of in this middle zone. We stay in this sort of 68-degree Fahrenheit room, and we have these indoor lights, but they're not really that powerful. They're missing some of the spectrum that comes from the sun, right? Particularly UV and infrared, since those are not energy efficient, and we don't want those. So we're missing all these components. We're in this no man's land. So often we work out, but maybe it's for half an hour, or we go for a walk, or we just do something kind of, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, right? And so we're not truly resting, and we're not truly engaged, right? Full engaged. So that's where you want to live. You want to live at the extremes. And then what you do with all that is critical, right? Like, what's really important for you. So for some people, it's gonna be exercise is the foundational thing that they really need to work on, that they really need to inculcate in their life. And it can be walking and yoga and Tai Chi, and it can be all kinds of movement patterns, the primal movements. It can be high intensity interval training, right? Like, whatever it is for them, that's going to be the biggest lever. And exercise is massive. When I was in working with people one-on-one, I would see people that would exercise regularly and have the worst habits everywhere else. And then I'd see other people that would have pretty darn good habits and they would barely work out. And the labs that would come back almost always favored the people who worked out regularly. Mm-hmm. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. And it's because it's moving, lymph and blood through the body, right? It's exchanging the fluids. It's getting rid of the waste. And this waste accumulation in the body is the most fundamental issue. In Ayurveda, they call it ama. Right? It's this idea that things build up in the system and they create destabilization at the cellular level, at the system level, loss of cellular intelligence, loss of communication, right? And things start to break down over time. So we need to move that waste out of the system. So what does that? Fasting, exercise, really good sleep, right? Like emotionally processing things and being in good relation with God, with people, with yourself, with the earth, with the animals, with the environment, everything, right? Mm-hmm. So these are all the mechanisms, right? And so for one person, exercise is going to be the biggest lever, and that's what they need to work on. For somebody else, it might be circadian rhythm. That's a huge one, right? Really dialing in circadian rhythm, getting up in the morning, getting light in the eyes, getting hopefully as much light on the body and in the eyes throughout the day as you can without burning. And then at night, slowing things down and really, really getting into this rest mode. And when you do that over the course of 2 or 3 weeks, your body starts getting entrained into this amazing pattern of physiology. And I've seen people that when they do that, they lose weight, their eyesight improves, their inflammation goes down, everything starts to improve. Food sensitivities go away, autoimmunity starts to improve, everything starts to improve just because circadian rhythm was starting to get optimized. Right. And for other people, I would say these are kind of the big ones I'm hitting. The relational piece, right? This trauma piece, right? I'm loosely calling it trauma, but it's the conditioning, it's the beliefs, it's the mental attitude that we're walking throughout the day. So many of us had rough childhoods, and we may not even have realized it because we've adapted. Because we're so resilient, humans are amazingly resilient. We become something we need to be to survive. And that might be the perfectionist. That might be the one who succeeds. That might be the engineer that goes and does these things for reasons he doesn't even know why, right? It could be somebody who's afraid to take chances, whatever the things, but we become these people. We have personality patterns that are reflected. We could be defensive. We could be disconnected. You've met people that are just, it's hard to connect with. No matter how hard they're trying, you feel like there's just not something here. I can't really get in there. Like there's a heart wall there, right? And that's not their fault. That's a defensive pattern because they were wounded at early points in childhood and perhaps even before that, that's created these adaptive patterns. So that would be their biggest sort of lever, is to focus on this internal work, processing this trauma, these experiences that haven't fully been digested. And again, leaning on Ayurveda because I love that modality so much. They even talk about this as a digestive thing that we need to process. Like we digest emotions, we digest experiences. And if we don't have good digestion, then those things that are left undigested, they can create physical ailments, mental ailments, right? The depressions, the anxieties, the knee pains, all this stuff can come from undigested emotion or experience. And so, doing things like EMDR, just if people are guided this way toward the plant medicines like ayahuasca and some of these other things, there's adult attachment repair model, which will repair attachment systems. So getting into sort of more of the psychology side of things, we have an attachment system that we can either feel secure in our attachment that usually comes from our caregivers, or we can be anxious, Like, and that came from the caregiver not really being there, or when we can't trust if the caregiver is going to be there or not going to be there. So we have this really anxious, and you see this typically portrayed in romantic comedies where the female is typically the person that exhibits this. As soon as the person gets close and they have the relationship's going well, she just like clings because she's like, don't go, like, and the male lead is typically like, oh, they have the avoidant pattern, right? Yeah. They have the avoidant pattern, like, oh my God, this is getting too close and it's making me nervous. This isn't safe to feel connected. So push away, right? That's the avoidant pattern. And again, that's represented in the rom-coms that way, but most of us carry one of these or even both of these patterns on the attachment system. And so even when we're in relationship, it's never really feeling secure. And when we talk about in the Blue Zones work and some of the longevity work, this idea of community comes up a lot. Like, oh, community is so important. And there's longevity studies about community and all that. And I'd say, yeah, kind of. But it's really the things about community that are important, the connection that community provides. So if a community doesn't provide connection, then the community is not really that great. It's the connection that we need. It's the safety that we need to feel. So when we feel those things, that's important. But if we have an attachment system disruption that needs to be repaired, well, then we're not going to feel that connection and safety in relationship to others or to group or to ourselves or to God or whatever the case is, right? So these are really, really deep and important things to focus on. And the reason, shortly, real quickly here, the reason it's so important to focus on these things is because they're impacting the nervous system function and the genetic expression that's going on all the time. So somebody might feel like, oh, I'm at rest, I'm in parasympathetic. No, that's just parasympathetic for them. Their system's still jacked up, pretty vigilant because the environment doesn't really feel safe. And then when they process some of these experiences and emotions, they have a new baseline where their nervous system can actually get a little bit more rest at baseline. So these are the things that start to show up when you work with people enough, and these sort of syndromes and these things that kind of go unchecked. They're happening in the background. And another one I'll quickly mention is DNRS, Dynamic Neural Retraining System, I believe it is. Unbelievably powerful to rewire the brain, to dip into the sort of idea of neuroplasticity and create new neural patterns, new behaviors, new thoughts, and new beliefs. And when you do that on a subconscious level, so that you're operating from a different place, then the world changes around you. Everything starts to change, and it changes internally as well. And that's really what gets people out of trouble in sort of the chronic disease sense, and also what's going to extend life, and so that we remain healthier as we age.
Amazing. Okay, tell people, because I think you learned so much. Like, I try to walk the walk as a practitioner, right? I could sit here and spout off all these, amazing things that people should do. Tell us, in Jason's 24 hours of every day that he gets, like, what are your non-negotiables when it comes to your lifestyle and how it plays out with longevity? What are the things you do every day?
I'm going to give you a little bit of a weird answer here, but because my pattern in the past has been so rigid, I've actually loosened my rigidity. So one of my non-negotiables is to actually be flexible. So even though I would sort of put sleep in this category as like a non-negotiable, there's times where I stay up late and I get crappy sleep because I feel like it's worth it for me to do whatever I need to do, even though I know how critical sleep is. And I would say that's probably the number one thing, is getting really good quality sleep between the right hours, which is about 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., give or take, depending on your genetics. It can vary, but that's a big one. I would say sleep. I think, but again, for me, it's actually being flexible, because that hyper rigidity actually creates, again, a nervous system that's hyper vigilant about, I got to do this and I got to do that and that can actually drive more stress internally, right? So me just loosening the reins a little bit has been a really big game changer for me to say, you know what? I don't need to take everything so serious. I can relax about some of this stuff, right? And I can't, and let go of this perfectionism. That's a big one. I would say exercise is another big one. That's a non-negotiable. Moving as much as I can, and there's times where I don't get as much movement, but moving in a way that's actually going to serve me. So for me, like, you might be able to tell, like, weights and exercise and building muscle has been a big part of my past, and it was a big part of the football that I played and the baseball that I played. But now, I'm actually moving in a way that is functional. So I'm actually bringing in more movements that are actually going to help me extend my longevity of the body itself, right? I want more flow in the body. So bringing in movements that maybe aren't fun, that you don't necessarily like at first, but you need, I think that can be a critical. And the other side of that is actually moving in a way that's fun too. So not everything's work, right? So playing, bringing in more play when it comes to movement, I think is a really big factor. And if you've got kids, that's a really, really easy thing to do, or a dog or something like that. But that's a really important thing. And then I think the third one would be constantly working on myself. And like I said, processing these wounds, these traumas, these conditionings, always looking at my belief system. Where did that come from? Why is it here? What can I do to change that? Right. And consciously doing the work day to day, but doing the subconscious work as well, and using a lot of these therapies in sort of the trauma world. And again, even if you don't think you have trauma, like this is a big one. And as we start to process these things, what I've noticed is life just gets easier. Right? Money shows up differently. Like finances aren't as big of a struggle. Relationships show up differently. I get more support now without even having to try. Like it just starts to come, right? Like things just work out, right? And when things don't work out, I'm not as stressed. So I don't spike as much into these patterns that I would have otherwise when I was younger. And so to me, this is a really, really key factor of just making an easy life.
Yeah. Okay. That's awesome. I love that. Because I think sometimes people get hyper focused on like, oh, it's just about perfecting my diet, or it's just about this. It's just about these are like all little puzzle pieces that all make a huge difference. And sometimes you have to figure out where to start. Okay. So Jason, I end all these podcasts with a semen analysis, and something I've been very interested in the last number of years is, low carbon ketogenic diets, because we deal with 88% of patients having insulin resistance or some kind of metabolic disease. It's a huge problem in the US. And of course, we're always looking for an answer. So I pulled this paper from 2018 called Ketone Bodies Mimic the Lifespan Extending Properties of Caloric Restriction. Now, just a little side note on this, the authors of this paper do have a little bias and invested interest, because they, Dr. Richard Beach and Karen Clark and Patrick Bradshaw and some of these people work in that space. They've invented ketone esters, and they have products available for sale. So, but it brings up something that I would love to get Jason's perspective on too, since he has spent his life studying this longevity project. So the extension of lifespan by calorie restriction has been studied across lots of different species, like yeast. There's something called C. elegans, which is basically like a worm, all the way to primates. And there's never been a generally accepted theory to explain the observations, but we know that basically caloric restriction extends lifespan. And they are proposing that the benefits of caloric restriction can be duplicated by ketosis. And it's been shown that this lifespan extension is from decreased signaling in the insulin-like growth factor receptor pathways. And basically it causes a bunch of genes to change, transcriptions in the genes, different enzymes to be produced. And it's an effective method for combating free radical damage, because when you metabolize ketone bodies, there is physiologic differences compared to oxidation of glucose. And so they also propose, of course, that this dietary ketone ester, like something you can drink instead of doing a ketogenic diet, something called an exogenous ketone, could help through these same pathways, because beta hydroxybutyrate change. I don't want to talk in like huge medical terms, but they work as a cellular signaling molecule. So it's not just like, oh, they're an energy, like they literally have epigenetic changes and changes within cells. And so they're basically saying that they think that ketones are a way to extend lifespan in humans. Jason, through all of your work that you have done, like, what are your thoughts about, because obviously fasting's been a hot thing, which is another way to get into ketosis. Like, what do you think about ketones and ketosis and longevity?
To be honest, I think a lot of this is, forgive my term here, but it's mental masturbation. So, and I sort of say that lovingly, there's nothing wrong with masturbation, I guess. I take ketones. So I take ketone esters. That's something I take every now and again, because I do believe in some of the signaling pathways that it induces. Trying to mimic things with artificial compounds, I think, is a fool's errand. So in other words, when we fast or when we do a calorie restricted diet for any amount of time, it's not just these XYZ pathways, right? We tend to look at that because that's all we can do in science. We only can look at what we can look at. We can't look at the whole thing, right? And so what's happening when you do a sort of fasting mimicking or fasted or some sort of caloric restriction, there's a million things happening, right? And we know a few of them, and we can identify the pathways, and that's great. But it's so much more than that, right? So I don't think we can mimic it with just this thing. The other thing that I'll say is that none of that was done by the people that I spoke with or anybody around the world. They didn't take any esters. They didn't really think about ketones. They didn't think about fasting as a way to extend life, right? So we're just kind of trying to figure things out in the scientific world with some of this stuff. So my whole take on all of this stuff, right? And this comes down to resveratrol, which has been shown to be a big bust, by the way. If you haven't looked at David Sinclair and his work, not good, basically fraudulent, up the wazoo in the tune of like billions and billions of dollars that a pharmaceutical company had to eat. Too bad for them. NAD is now coming under fire as a direct source of like, we're not so sure. NMN looks to be pretty good, maybe NR, but the NAD pathway. So my point to this is that we're constantly looking at all these things thinking we understand what's happening. And the truth is that we don't. There's so much going on and we're learning, and that's great. And it's worth studying. And I think there's some things, but a lot of the studies are flawed. A lot of the studies, as you pointed out, can be biased, and there's nothing wrong with that. We all have biases, right? That's just the way it is. We're human. We can't exclude that. But the premise can be flawed, the conclusion can be flawed, and then not only that, it can be extended by the media and the sort of more sort of scientific media, let's say, and then carried through. And then this is what happens with things like resveratrol, and all of a sudden it's the latest craze that everybody's jumping on, including me. I jumped on it. For years I thought, oh, resveratrol, great. This is sirtuins and blah blah blah. Turns out it was kind of not really true, right? And so we can all get hyped up on these molecules. And what I would say is hold it all lightly. Like, the real gold here, caloric restriction, fasting windows, right? This is something, why? Because it's something we've done for thousands of years. It's something we see show up in religious communities, different religious organizations or beliefs and traditions have inculcated this into their practices, right? So there's something, and a lot of the sort of shamans and things that I've worked with and Ayurveda, they actually say that fasting is a spiritual payment. In other words, it's something, and you find this in the religious worlds, right? Like it's actually something we do. So there's deeper stuff here. I think we gotta get out of this sort of molecule-based reality and start to open ourselves up to a deeper reality. And when we do something like intermittent fasting, or maybe a 3-day fast, or maybe even longer if we can, and we can do water only, or we can do no water fast, right, for a certain period of time. And that shows in the scientific literature some really interesting things. When you engage with these things, you find mental things start to come up, right? When you go into these cleanses, I do like an Ayurvedic cleanse, like a 10-day Ayurvedic panchakarma, which is just eating khichdi, which is kind of mung dal and rice with some turmeric and other things. And you do some other cleansing aspects. But as you cleanse the body, as you detox the body, as you go through these fasting windows, you'll see emotional processes start to come up. You might get really depressed or really anxious, or have, you might start to cry. Like there's all kinds of things you watch people go through. And so to me, that's more interesting, right? Like, sure, there's changes at the microbiota level. So I'd be asking the question there, what's happening with the microbes if we take these things, exogenously versus going to fast? Well, if we fast, then we know the microbes in the gut particularly change dramatically, right? They express totally different things. Things come into balance. There's more diversification. So that's more interesting. Like, look at the lifestyle. We're trying to mimic too much. We're trying to biohack too much. And that's what science does. That's what medical systems do, is they try to find a solution to something natural so they can make money off of it. And there's an industry. Otherwise, it wouldn't get funded. Like, that's just the reality. And you know this, right? It's like, we don't study, like melatonin is one of my favorite things ever, and we don't study it. And it's like in the longevity research, it's one of the most promising molecules ever. It regrows the thymus. Thymus gland starts to shrink when you're 13 years old. So we lose thymic function, which is T cell function and other things. We lose that at 13. It goes downhill quick. Melatonin regrows that. There's an intimate connection between the pineal gland and the thymus gland. So there's really fascinating stuff, but nobody studies melatonin. Because you can't make money, you can't patent it. So we got to be really careful with these things. I think I look at them with interest. I'm really curious about them. Like I said, I take some ketones, and when I do some fasted workouts or what have you, I do think there's some signaling that is beneficial, but I don't hang my hat on that, right? I'd actually rather hang my hat on eating in the proper windows, reducing my, eating in the proper way, not too much food, right? Overloading my system and creating digestive issues, right? Eating in the proper windows, all these things. I think that's more interesting. And then doing these sort of periodic fastings or cleanses in Ayurvedic and Panchakarma, you do this cleanse or detox kind of period when the seasons change, because these sort of buildup of the energies then can get cleansed and move through and balanced. So to me, there's deeper wisdoms here. If we look at Ayurveda, if we look at Chinese medicine, if we look at the traditional indigenous societies, even the religious cultures and societies, what are they doing? What has been done for thousands of years and why? So don't just do it, but like figure out what's going on. And it turns out the science that we know about explains it really well, right? So to me, I think there's just more interesting ways to get to the core of what we're looking at here with some of these studies, which isn't to make them wrong. It just makes them a little bit limited in what they're really telling us.
That's awesome. I love everything you're saying. I think we could go on for like 5 hours. And I love how you talk about Ayurvedic medicine. I went back after I was a private practice OBGYN for many years and did an integrative medicine fellowship and at the Andrew Weil University of Arizona School of Integrative Medicine. And so we do some Ayurvedic, some Eastern medicine. I'm certified in acupuncture, auricular acupuncture. And so
really,
it's funny as a Western medical practitioner, like we think of so many of these things as just like kind of woo, because we don't, like, that's not how we're trained. They did actually, in my traditional medical training, they did bring in like a Reiki master and some other people. We had like one day basically of like these alternative therapies. And, but it's interesting to hear you talk about it, because I think that like there's lots of pathways to healing and like it's different for everybody. And I do think we get so hyper-focused sometimes on like what we're eating and how we're moving. And if you're not dealing with all this other stuff, like it still has a profound impact on your health. So I love what you're doing, Jason. So tell people, first of all, how to find the Human Longevity Project.
Yeah, they can go to awakenedhealthacademy.com, and that's a place where I have a lot of my content and host the film series there.
How long does it take to sit down and watch it's a 9-part series?
It's a 9-part series. It's probably 13 hours of like really intense educational content with some fun mixed in. But each episode is, an hour and a half. And so it's digestible in that way.
Okay. So you guys, I have learned recently, Jim Quick, I'm a huge follower of Jim Quick. So your brain can only focus for like 25 minutes. So sit down and watch each episode 25 minutes and then, maybe do some stretching or some push-ups or something, and then go back in the next 25 minutes. Cause that's probably an amazing amount of information to digest.
Yeah. If you like the intellectual kind of understanding of some of this and why to do some of these things, we had so many brilliant experts that we interviewed to help communicate that message. And it's amazing. Honestly, they did a really good job, and we pulled it together nicely, I think, in a way that's understandable.
Amazing. Okay. And then tell people how they can find you on social media or how they can work with you as a practitioner.
Yeah. Well, first tell them about my book. beyondlongevity.com is where they can find that. So if they're interested in that, it comes out.
Is it out? It's out? Coming out?
December 27th. At the time we're recording this, not out yet, but it's available for pre-sale. But yeah, that's you can find that at Amazon, any bookstores. And then social media, they can find me on Instagram. Human Longevity Project is probably the best place they can find me. And same thing with Facebook. I don't do a ton of social media, to be honest. More through my own email list and working with people that I interact with there. But yeah, they can find me there.
That might be a smart strategy. I won't lie. It's a deep dark hole some days. Yeah. Well, Jason, this has been so wonderful. And thank you for everybody listening. If you found this helpful, please share it with somebody, because we really depend on all of you to help share these messages with the world. So thank you guys, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Did you guys love that last episode of the Fit and Fabulous podcast? Well, of course you did. And I want to keep bringing you the most amazing content from the most incredible people. And you can help me by subscribing to the Dr. Fit and Fabulous channel. You guys know where the button is. Just click it. It's the doctor's orders.